Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. For those of you that are watching live, you know that I go live almost every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central to talk about something quilting related and answer your questions live. Of course, if you're not watching live, no worries. You can leave your questions in the comments, and I get on there from time to time to answer them. Jessica's here as always, monitoring the chat, kicking off the spammers, and then writing your questions down so I can answer them at the end. And when I'm doing a live chat, if it's not related to the topic, that's fine too. We can go almost any direction we want to. And if I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up. I'm really good at that. But last week's live chat, we kind of talked about the new video series coming up, the new Floral Frames Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, where we're going to talk about borders. And I thought I would kind of stick with that theme this week and do a little bit of Q&A about quilting the borders of your quilt. I'm going to give you some just tips on how to work around the borders and pick designs. And I have a few pictures to show, nothing too big or too crazy, but like I said, if you're watching live, you can type in your questions and I'll answer them at the end of the chat. So again, the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along that's starting, there's a link in the description box that will show you a cute little pin. Anybody that purchases a panel to go with, purchase a panel for the challenge, will get a free pin with that too. So super excited about that. So when we're looking at the borders of our quilts, and the reason I thought this would be a great topic for a video series is there's so many things to consider, right? If we're thinking about the borders, the questions that normally come up in a class setting are things like, how do I work my way through it? Do I do it at the beginning or the end? How do you pick designs for that area? And honestly, quilting borders is my least favorite part of the quilt, which I know sounds bad because I love quilting. The problem is when I'm quilting on my long arm, especially, the first border, I'm super excited about the project, but by the time I get to the end of the quilt, I'm super over it, right? I'm just wanting to be done with this thing. And so usually just having to deal with that last border is that last bit. I'm like, oh, I just want to get it finished. In fact, when I was trying to pull up pictures of quilts with borders, I'm like, I don't really have a lot because I don't make very many quilts with borders. So it's kind of funny, but I did find some old customer quilts pictures and kind of talk through how to pick out designs for those. It's lots of fun. The first question I want to talk about, or the first thing is like, when do you quilt the borders, right? When you're looking at your quilt, really it's up to you, especially if you're on a sewing machine. You have the option because you can start anywhere you want on the quilt when you're quilting on that sewing machine. And ultimately, it's just what feels comfortable to you. Do you want to do it at the beginning? Do you want to do it at the end? Do you want to do it as you go, which is usually what I do on the long arm? Any of them are great. It really depends on your preferences. I know that when I talk to quilters, when I'm out traveling and teaching, that some quilters are like, I want to do the same design until it's done. I want to get into that rhythm. I want to keep going, keep that momentum going. So doing the border all at once is a great option. For me, personally, I get pretty bored doing the same design over and over again. So switching back and forth in between the border and the center of the quilt really fits my personality. Now, for those of you that are quilting on a long arm, it's a little bit of a different thing, right? If we think about how a long arm is set up on the frame, we're quilting in straight rows, kind of in horizontal lines. And so the horizontal borders are no problem, right? It's those vertical borders that will give us trouble. So when I'm looking at that quilt, if I want to save the border all for the end, then that means I need to kind of stabilize that border as I work my way down. I don't like doing that. I prefer trying as much as I can to quilt the border while I'm there. But that means I have to be kind of creative with my design selections. And throughout the video series, we're going to see a lot of those designs that can be broken up into chunks. Now, for those of you on a long arm, the question sometimes comes up, should I take the quilt off and turn it to get those side borders? And you absolutely can. I've talked to a lot of quilters that do that. Save those vertical borders for the end, take off the quilt and turn it. And that way you can quilt those other borders in a straight continuous motion. There really is no wrong way to go about it. So as you're quilting, think through it and like, how do I feel about this? How can I make this a little bit easier? And just know that really, as long as the quilt gets done, it's fine however you go about it. So when I'm working though on the borders, I tend to quilt it as I go in chunks, trying to transfer in between the center and the outside. And that's the case no matter what machine I'm using. If I think about a sewing machine, it's easy enough to work in one long straight line and turn the quilt. But again, like I said, I get a little bored. But I also like to handle anything while I'm there. Skipping ahead and having to come back is never a fun option for me. I like to go ahead and handle everything while I'm there and move on so that I don't have to come back to that spot. So really, we can treat it like any other portion of our quilt. We just have to kind of think about how we want to handle it. Now, I did pull together some pictures of some different quilts that we can go over. Hold on, I'm in the wrong place. So we can see some actual design ideas. Because once we figure out how we're going to work our way through the quilts, we got to figure out what we're going to quilt. So like I said, the Floral Frames Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, that whole border video series, that's going to be starting pretty soon. It's going to be starting in May. And we're going to be talking through some different free videos or different tutorials about how to handle the borders in different ways. So we're going to see how to create motifs, how to chunk the borders, which I mean sounds kind of like an ice cream, but it's not, turning the corners and building off of that and quilting that panel. So this is kind of like leading us up to that and kind of giving you some things to think about before we even get started. And this is the custom panel I designed for the challenge. I know that a lot of you watched last week, you know what I'm talking about, but if you just happen to stumble along and you're like, what's going on? You can get the exclusive panel that I designed for the challenge and you can quilt along with me on the panel. Not required, of course, but definitely appreciated. All right, so when we're thinking about picking out the designs for our borders, right? The thing I think about is how much do I love the center of the quilt? I know this sounds weird, but when I look at a quilt, I don't feel like I need to do difficult stuff everywhere. I feel like if the center is kind of easier to piece, nothing too crazy, I might do a really ornate border around it. But if the center is very busy or very precise or the focus, I might take it a little bit easier in the border. So I don't feel the need to like go over the top on all areas of the quilt. Unless, of course, it's Tula Pinks. So I pulled this quilt out because it's from the 100 Blocks book by Tula, which is so fun. I mean, you want to talk about a sampler quilt beyond. Every one of those blocks is separate and different. But the quilting, all the pieces were small, so the quilting in the center was fairly basic for me. It's nothing too crazy in the center as far as the quilting. So I decided to use the outside border as a way to really draw, to have an area to play in and do some more complex looking quilting. So in this, it's kind of tricky because I'm treating it like a border, even though that border fabric is the same color as the background. Probably I don't know, but I'm assuming when she designed it, she wanted those blocks to look like they're floating. But even though it's maybe not technically a border, I treated it as a border. So adding a little bit more detail in those bigger borders where you can see the quilting, where the quilting in the center isn't too crazy over the top. That's kind of how I look at it. Now, again, if you've watched any of my live chats, you know that I'm only the expert of my opinion, but this is how I like to handle it. So really, when I was quilting on this one, it's been several years. That's why the picture isn't the best. It's amazing how much cell phone camera photos or cameras have come up in the years past. But when I looked at it, I really struggled with the borders here because I loved how geometric and modern the blocks were. And I mean, there's nothing I love more than throwing a big old feather on a Tula Pink quilt. But I just felt like, I don't know, maybe we should go a little bit more geometric, maybe something a little bit more modern. Now, I want to pause right here because I know sometimes I'll say, oh, if the center is curvy, I should do something different, or I'll like geometric, or I'll say if the center is curvy, I should do more curvy. It really doesn't matter. I mean, I think you can just do whatever you want. But here I was thinking something a little bit more geometric and something to pull the border into the blocks. And so those diagonal lines I quilted kind of almost extend into the sashing, or they do extend into the sashing, just to kind of help pull them together. So again, if I'm dealing with like a thinner border, there's really not a whole lot of room of options for that area, but definitely for the bigger borders where you can actually see the quilting. I don't like to spend a lot of time quilting anything ornate that you can't even see when I'm finished. So this particular quilt is a perfect example of a bigger border, but busy fabric. So I can't even remember, I think I quilted this for the Robert Kaufman Fabric Company. I don't remember who pieced it or the pattern or anything, but it's a perfect example of multiple borders, right? So I have the maroon border, the white border, and then that busy batik kind of large border. Now that large border, that large outer border would be perfect for quilting a nice focal feather, adding something ornate, but I knew you weren't going to be able to see it anyway. In fact, as you're probably looking at the screen, you might be like, is there even quilting in that bigger border? So I just did an all over swirl design. Again, unless you're practicing, it's a great place to practice a design. But if you're not going to see the quilting anyway, might as well do something that's quick and easy for you. And then even in that maroon border, I don't even remember what I put in there. I can't quite see it. And then in that white border, since we could see the quilting a little bit, I did a serpentine line, just kind of pulling out some of the designs from the center. And when I'm looking at my quilt, I love to use repetition or use the same design in different ways and in different areas, just because it kind of keeps it easy for me. So since I did serpentine lines in some of the blocks, I decided that would be a great border option for that white border. So again, when I'm picking designs, it really, really depends on the fabric that's being used, how much space I have, and how much I love the center or how intricate the center is. All right, this particular picture is not the best picture, but it's a very striking, large quilt. It's an Amish-inspired solid quilt. I mean, those borders are ginormous. I can't even remember, but so huge. And they're solid fabric. So I knew that I could do something a little bit more elegant, a little bit more detailed, especially since the piecing, I'm not saying basic in a bad way, just basic in minimal piecing, large areas of space, and then of course solids. So in that instance, perfect. That's a playground for me. And I'm going to quilt some really elegant designs. And the reason I did feathers is just because I felt like quilting feathers that day. I could have went with a more geometric shape. I think it would have looked fine, but I was just feeling feathers of all styles from the center out. But you can kind of see the different feather designs in the different borders. So in that aqua border, just more like a feather motif. In the blue, dark blue border, another feather motif, just a little bit bigger, a little bit different. And then in the black, just some big feathers that move around. So a perfect example, two different quilts, the batiks where you can't see the quilting or the solids where you can, just being really intentional about the placement of that. Now I know this is kind of zoomed in, but perfect example of a busy fabric, multiple borders. I always think it's amazing when people piece so many borders on their quilt. I don't like piecing them. That's probably why I don't like quilting them. But I love the look of it. And so saving any quilting that, you can see, I'm going to do the ribbon candy in those lighter blue strips because you can actually see it. But in that floral print that's so beautiful and bold, you're not going to see the quilting anyway. So again, another swirl filler, saving the time or investing my quilting time in the areas that you can actually see. And then in the dark blue border, you can see just a little loopy kind of wavy line, again, because it was a busier fabric and you couldn't really see it. So even in multiple borders on a quilt, I'm still looking at the fabric and the size. If this had been pieced with solids and in that bigger border, I could have really done something really cool in there, but again, we couldn't see it, so I'm not gonna do that. Now, sometimes you can just ignore the borders altogether, just pretend like they don't exist. And this particular quilt, the butterfly quilt by Tula Pink, with the two strips on the top and the bottom, technically a border, but I just treated it like the background. I quilted those feathers so they just went right into that area and just kind of ignored it. So when you're looking at your quilts, if you're doing it all over and you're like, I don't really want to do the borders separate, I just want to quilt this whole thing, totally fine. It's going to look great no matter what you do. So in this particular example, I think the reason I did the feathers like that, because they're so big and I wanted them to wrap around. So I'm like, well, we're just going to quilt right on over this border fabric. So again, you don't have to quilt the borders separate. You can definitely pick and choose what you want to do. And the last picture, again, I didn't have a whole lot of quilts to show. So hopefully you have some questions to ask. But in this particular quilt, I showed how I quilted it in a couple of live chats, a live chat a couple of weeks ago. But another perfect example of all the beautiful piecing on the inside, so intricate. I had so much fun quilting it. I know you can't really see all the detail, but I just did a lot of different details in there. So when it came to the border, I didn't feel like I needed to do anything crazy. I mean, the border was about 3 inches or so not quite big enough for a feather. I'd done all this intricate stuff in the center, so I just quilted it with a, you guessed it, swirl filler. And it's also busier fabric. So again, just kind of picking the designs to fit in those areas just makes it a little bit easier. Now I know that that's kind of a quick rundown, like 6 pictures and here we go. But I think when you're looking at your quilt, I think one thing that helps when you're picking out designs is giving yourself some rules to follow. So my rule, I've kind of shared some of those, and that just points me in a direction and makes it a little bit easier for picking those designs. But when it comes to picking out designs for any areas of our quilt, right? Isn't that the magic question? Like, oh, well, how should I quilt this? The thing is, you're going to find, the more you do it, the more you find what you do and don't like. And so that's why throughout the video series, which starts in May, which in just like a month, we're going to talk through not only design ideas, but how do we do things like turn the corner? How do we move through the quilt in an efficient way that makes sense to us? So we're going to kind of dive even deeper into that in the video series. And if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, all the videos will be on my YouTube channel. So if you're a subscriber, you'll get a notification once that video comes out, and they'll come out every week until the video series is over. Or you can always visit my website, quiltingismytherapy.com, and you can watch previous Free Motion Challenge quilting alongs. So you can definitely check out either one of those. Should you be sitting at home thinking, I don't have any projects to work on, I need one. Although that's not usually how it works, right? We usually have more projects than time, but you know, that's just how it goes. All right, any questions for us? Good, good. I hope everybody has a happy Easter weekend. I hope everybody does well. All right, when I'm quilting a wishbone or ribbon candy and I want to end it without running into an edge, what are some ways to start and stop? So what this makes me think of, and I'm not sure if I understand this correctly, but sometimes I'll use wishbone or ribbon candy as a filler, like in between other designs. And I'm gonna do my finger, we'll see if this makes sense. When I decide I'm done and I don't have a hard edge, I just go right into a swirl and then move on. So, and that's gonna work with the ribbon candy or the wishbone. Ultimately, just stop, transfer into a different design, and then if there's any weird gaps, you can come back and echo in between them. But I promise, once you step back, you're not gonna see the transition there. It's just gonna kind of flow from one to the next. And we'll actually, I'm trying to think if we'll see that in the video series. It's an easy way to just go from one to the next, but that's how I do it. How long have I had my shop? So for those of you that aren't aware, we have a quilt shop. Quilting is my therapy. You got to keep the branding the same, right? We're located just outside of Kansas City, Missouri, in Liberty, Missouri, beautiful historic downtown, and only 45 minutes from Missouri Star Quilt Company. I was going to put that in the awning, but on the awning outside, but I thought that was a little tacky. We've had the shop for almost 7 years in November, so just over 6. And it's so fun to think about how well it's doing, because when we opened it, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, people were like, you're crazy. Quilt shops are closing. I'm like, I don't know, I think it'll work. And it has, so it's been great. Even though I love machine quilting, the shop sells everything quilting related. So from fabric to patterns to notions to all sorts of stuff. So hopefully you can make it in if you're in the area. What is my best advice for doing the challenge for a brand new long arm owner? And there is the question that comes up, and there's the thing that the fact of the matter is, quilting this on the long arm spread over 6 weeks is not ideal for me. If I were participating in the challenge, not filming it and producing it, I would probably wait till the very end, load the quilt, and then quilt through all the sections. It's just not easy to take the quilt on and off, especially if you quilt for customers or have other projects. Keeping your frame tied up for 6 weeks is not ideal for me. Now, for a new long arm owner, brand new one, I would suggest that just wait to the end. But there are some options. If you're like, no, I want to quilt along with you, Angela, then that's totally fine. What you can do is take it off and on, work your way through it first and stabilize it, make sure it's all stitched down, and then you can take it on and off. Or I know some people will actually get an extra set of leaders. That way they can just Velcro off the quilt and then put it back on. So there are some options. I know it's not ideal, and there's really, I mean, the more I've tried thinking about how to make this great for long armers as well as for myself, not having to come up with all the videos at once, and there really is not the best option. On a sewing machine, you don't have that problem, right? You just take the quilt out, put your next one in, or do what you need to do. So unfortunately, that's the rub. Do you float your quilt tops? If so, how do you know that you're keeping your edges straight? I do. So on a long arm, floating your quilt top means that it's not pinned to the leaders. It's just kind of stitched down, and then the bottom is all hanging everywhere. And that's how I do it. I float all my quilt tops, from tiny ones to really big ones. Everyone gets floated. The reason I like this is it's hanging down in the front. I can see how it's progressing, and if there's any issues, I can handle it before it just shows up. But you do have to make sure that as you progress through the quilt that you're doing it correctly, because you'll get a quilt that's kind of sucked up in the middle. So every time I advance it, I'm just checking to make sure that the edges are straight, whether just visually looking at the bar, or you can measure over if you want to be extra sure, and then just being really intentional about stabilizing the sides and then filling in. But yeah, if you've tried or wanting to try floating your quilt tops, start with a smaller quilt and see how you like it. But I do love it. How many layers of batting did I use on the first quilt that I showed? So that quilt, the one for Tula, all of her quilts, I used 2 layers of batting. And normally, if you've listened to the live chats, you've heard this before, normally I'll use 2 layers of Quilter's Dream poly. So it's just kind of like this thin poly, almost like felt. It's just really pretty. That quilt, if I remember correctly, we did 2 layers, but I think I did 1 poly and 1 puff. I'm pretty sure, because we really wanted to try to get some of that detail for the photography. It was a lot to manage. The puffiness is a lot to kind of manage, so I prefer the 2 poly, but that's 2 layers I use that. No matter what I try, the bottom of my quilt always ends up being 1 inch narrower on the top, or 1 inch narrower than the top. How can I keep it from drifting? I float my tops. The bottom of my quilt always ends up 1 inch narrow. So as you're progressing, it's sucking in. And as you advance, you really have to be sure that you're tugging that quilt. You're making sure that it's lined up. If your long arm has channel locks, you can line up on the edge, put your channel lock on, and make sure that it's staying straight. But one thing I do, and I always said I would never say this, but I'll tell you guys, one thing I do, and it sounds so weird, but it helps. As I advance the quilt, each time I grab the quilt bottom and I tug in the center, because that's where it usually pulls up in. So, I mean, I'm not like grabbing it very hard. I'm just giving a little tug to make sure that it's not sucking up in the center. So you could try that. That's probably what's happening. It's sucking up in the center and it's creating that, that effect. Another thing you can do, and I don't know if this is going to make sense as I talk through it, as you're progressing through your quilt on your long arm, we're specifically talking about long arms here, when I get towards the bottom where I only have like 2 passes left, I might skip ahead and do the border and then finish up right above it. The reason being, I can, since it's not quilted all the way to the border, I can do a little bit of creative tugging or manipulating of the fabric to get it in place and then quilt the rest down. If you're like, I have no idea what she means by that, then never mind. That's a different thing. But I will say that if the bottom of your quilt is always the one that's wrong, it's probably because you're not progressing through it. You're not, taking care of it as you advance. And so just being really intentional about it, paying attention will really help that. Another thing you can do for those of you that have a long arm and float your top, you can get a clamp that will go over the top and the bar, just kind of hold it in place. Again, if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, or I'm on a sewing machine, I don't even have a long arm, you can just ignore that whole part. So that's why I love doing the live questions, because it's just, we never know what we're going to get. It's great assortment. So please don't be afraid to type them out there. And we don't get to all of them, but we get to as many as we can. And of course, if you don't get your question answered, you can always pop on over to the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along Facebook page, ask it there, and people will answer, or you can leave it in the comments and I'll get on there from time to time to answer. So as we're getting ready to move into a busy season, right? I know May is busy for everybody, and the challenge is going to start in May. My 2 girls have birthdays in May, Mother's Day, Jessica and I have kids graduating in May. It's just all the things. Just know that the videos will be here whenever you are. I know that when I get on before we go live, I type chat with everybody. Always people say, oh, I haven't got it done yet. I haven't got it done yet, whatever. I know real life gets in the way, and I don't want you to stress out about it. This is our hobby, and this is what we get to do for fun, and so you'll get to it when you can get to it. The videos will be there waiting for you whenever you are. All right, everybody, I hope you have a great Easter weekend. I hope everybody's enjoying the beautiful spring weather, if it is nice in your area, and I'll be back next week, next Thursday at 3 p.m. Central with another live chat. Until then, everybody, happy